My name is Ryan Wallner, and I'm a technical marketing engineer at Pure Storage, specifically working on the Portworx project. Work, I spend a lot of time outside. I love mountain biking, hiking, just generally being in the woods where, devices aren't as useful, information can't get us, and notifications can't get us. So usually if you don't find me working on something in the Kubernetes space, I'm either taking care of my daughter or somewhere in the woods on a mountain bike, most likely. This goes back to when I was still in my undergrad program. I was part of a joint study, which is sort of like a internship program, with I was at IBM at the time, and it basically let you work on projects in the data center space. And so as an internship, we got to work on things like just booting up Linux and configuring a Linux system, and not necessarily something you get as part of your everyday coursework in your undergrad program. So this was a nice like place to go and kind of work on software projects and those kind of things. And I got involved as part of that joint study with what we called the Open Flow Testing Lab, which was a software-defined networking protocol called OpenFlow. And we were sort of because of the joint study, we had data center space, rack and power, that we could sort of as a as a university or a college program accept hardware to sort of test these protocols. And in that space, a lot of that code was open source, right? So I specifically worked on a project called Big Switch Floodlight. So Big Switch was the company, but they had a product or a project called Floodlight, and it was all an open source project written in Java at the time. And we were sort of volunteering and sort of learning at the same time to kind of add modules to that code base, and it allowed us to kind of work on projects as part of our studies, as well as submit those projects to conferences. So we got, as part of that project, with Floodlight, I think I had written a quality of service module for Floodlight, and we submitted it to an AMPAN conference. And I think three of us, as part of that joint study, got to go to Hawaii as part of that, which was a great benefit to working on a open source software project, I would say. And we were able to all go out there and kind of present our work. But that was my real like first project in the open source space, and that actually connected me with various people that I'm still in touch with today, right? And that was over a decade ago, which is sort of the alternate side of open source, is really the community behind it, and getting to know like people who are also dedicating their time and are involved in it. And some of those contacts, I still keep in touch with, as I said, which is pretty cool. The data on Kubernetes community really drew me in, because it's been a passion of mine for a while, right? And I have to go back a little bit to, I started working at EMC out of college, and obviously there was a very big storage focus at that company. And at the time, I was working in software-defined networking and storage, and I had sort of started working with Linux containers, and it led me to a very early version of Docker in 2015. And I started working for a different company, a startup called Cluster HQ, which had an open source project called Flocker, which was basically storage drivers for Docker before Kubernetes was really public and mainstream. And so really early on, I was involved in sort of this container space, and how it uses storage, how it consumes LUNs, or how applications like databases can work in containers, since 2015. And, that company had been really early to market. It was a fun project. It was all written in Python. I got to contribute a lot to it. And that company ran out of money, unfortunately. But I was still passionate about, like, this seems like it's going to take off. And I had gone back to sort of the non-vendor side or non-startup side and worked for a few years, um, and eventually made my way back into this space at Portworx, which is now part of the parent company that I work for now, which is very much in the same space, like consuming storage, whether it's software-defined storage or other types of storage for containers, and obviously with a focus in Kubernetes now, whereas that first project wasn't. So it's been sort of a part of my career for a long time, and how applications built for Kubernetes or built for containers can consume and use storage. So when I had heard about the data on Kubernetes community, it was kind of a no-brainer for me to kind of say, well, this is definitely somewhere where I want to, help either contribute or just be with sort of like-minded individuals who are either trying to work in this space or learn more about it, or stuff like that. Future of data on Kubernetes, it's sort of a loaded question, isn't it? Right. I think the obvious place to start is, sort of what's the future of Kubernetes, right? I had a conversation with an individual earlier today that, they were going into a study that said, I think it was like, a lot of organizations are still in somewhere of a 5% of their workloads are still out, or are in containers, and a lot of them are still out in VMs. And we got into a conversation of sort of like, VMware, I think, was founded in the late 1990s, right? And it's been 20 plus years of proliferation of using virtual machines, and that experience, from bare metal to virtual machines, at least felt pretty similar. Whereas, a virtual machine to a container, or an orchestration platform like Kubernetes is vastly different, in my opinion, I guess. And now we're also trying to say, these things you've been running in those systems, like databases or just data, uh, you know, services, run them in containers, and do it as part of, data on Kubernetes, so to speak. And it just kind of set the tone for me to say, we're still really early days, even though Kubernetes is 10 years old. And that means the data on Kubernetes space is still even earlier in its days. And I think being involved in this space for quite some time, from early on, it makes me feel like, well, I feel like everyone should at least be aware of what we're trying to kind of bring to the community, or talk about with data on Kubernetes. But it's still a very new thing for a lot of people. So for a lot of organizations as well. So I think part of the future of data on Kubernetes is really seeing that transition from, hey, I'm not quite ready to run data on Kubernetes, because Kubernetes in general is still a very new technology to my org. For a lot of different companies, that's probably a true statement, right? And then there's sort of the bleeding edge of what's the future of data on Kubernetes. And it's hard not to talk about AI and generative AI, and what those workloads look like, because the massive amounts of data they need access to at the core to train models, and then what we're doing with inferencing at the edge, and what access to sort of RAG implementations, and there's a lot of data pieces there, when it comes to running on Kubernetes. So I think there's a lot going on, to really help people realize that there's a lot of use cases for data on Kubernetes, both from where do we get started with maybe a more straightforward example like a single database on Kubernetes, to more complex sort of ML pipeline, or that kind of thing. It's great to see how far it's come, but the future is definitely moving in that direction.